what's impacting the electric vehicle industry in 2024? Brian Irwin is managing director and leader of the automotive sector of Alvarez and Marcel. Hi, Brian.
Morning, Bob. How are you today?
Great. Thank you very much for being with me.
It's a
Brian, let's
pleasure.
Brian, let's talk about some key factors that are impacting the electric vehicle or EV rollout in 2024. First, what's happening on the regulatory front and other types of government action that affect that industry.
On a regulatory side, I think the topic that gets the most airtime right now is what's happened with the IRA, or specifically the incentives on electric vehicles.
Mhm.
What we did note, of course, was that in 2023 calendar year, a greater number of EV vehicles were eligible for the IRA sales credit or tax credit. In January 1st, the restrictions changed, and consequently, a number of vehicles fell out of eligibility. Now, some OEMs reacted immediately to that, offering incentives on their vehicles that no longer applied. Others did not. As a consequence, it's one of the factors that has led to reduced growth in the EV sector.
Okay. And we'll talk about that in a moment, more about consumer demand. But what about this increasing trend, not just in EVs, but in automaking in general, toward unionization? How do you think that's going to impact the growth of EV production in the coming years?
It's an interesting topic because I think you have cost increases that are occurring for the OEMs on two dimensions. On the first, most obvious, are those OEMs that were part of the collective agreement last year. And we saw increases in wages of anywhere 25, 26, 27% over the 3-year period. Again, almost immediately, OEMs that were not represented by the collective agreement offered up, if you will, a raise to their labor force. So across the board, what we saw happening was an increase in the cost of the vehicle, increase of the cost of goods sold for the vehicle, higher for the OEMs that have a union, not quite so high for those that don't. The question is, what happens with those increased costs? Two things: either A, they're passed through to the consumer, or B, they're absorbed by the OEM themselves. And in that context, it's either a reduction in profitability or a further drive for efficiency. In other words, can we offset the labor costs through reduction in other costs or increased efficiency and throughput?
Mm-hmm. What about that A versus B? What are we actually seeing in terms of how the auto industry is reacting?
The first line of defense is always to see if we can absorb the costs ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the 25% in labor is a pretty significant lift. So it's questionable whether all of that will be able to be absorbed by efficiency improvements. We also know that the OEMs are pushing back through the supply chain and asking their tier ones to do what they can to further reduce costs and pass that through to the OEMs. On the other dimension, Bob, is can you pass it on to the consumer? And right now, there's a lot of headwinds on that one, and I'll tell you why. One of the big concerns in the industry right now is that of affordability. And what I mean by that is how willing and capable is the American car buying populace to spend more on the vehicle. We have two things at play there. Number one is that our vehicles, the vehicles that are sold to us today, cost considerably more than they did 5 years ago. The other side of that is that interest rates are at 20-year highs. And America is a payment buyer when it comes to vehicles. So with the increased capital cost and the increased financing costs, America's car payments have increased dramatically. And I think towards the last quarter of 2023, we saw double-digit percentage of car payments in America greater than $1,000 a month, which
Wow.
is incredibly high.
Okay, so we have the regulations, or we have the credits. Are going away for some vehicles. We have the issues that you just discussed with me about rising prices of cars. There are also problems with consumer perception. Maybe it's even reality about the practicality of EVs right now. Range anxiety, charging station availability, charging time. Those are still big issues in terms of purchasing an EV, right?
Absolutely, all three of those. Now, over time, we'll, as an industry, we'll be able to address all those. I'll add one more to your list, Bob, and that is the availability of an electric vehicle in the configuration that I'm looking for.
Mm.
So recall that when EVs first were introduced in mass to the US population, I mean, they were only in a couple of different segments. Gradually, that is evolving, and we're getting vehicle EV options in more and more segments, most recently in pickup trucks. But the difference, the situation we still have today is that an electric vehicle pickup truck is still considerably more expensive than an ICE vehicle pickup truck. So again, we've got the affordability. And the question is that, have we addressed the concept or the element of availability if there's still a significant step up? There was some research that came out just recently in terms of consumers' willingness to spend on an electric vehicle. And the data that was released, it showed that an incredibly large proportion of EV consider those that are considering to buy an EV are doing so under $40,000. There's a part of the population that say, I really want to spend under $30,000. And right now, there are very, very few EVs priced at that level.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
So the issue we have again is the availability of a vehicle in the segment I want at the price point I'm willing to spend.
That's a tall order for a lot of consumers these days. What then is also happening in the meantime with regard to the EV supply chain? The idea how much production, how much raw materials, how much assembly and the like is being brought over to North America generally, even the United States specifically, from Asia. Is that actually happening, and what impact might that have on availability and price?
So there is a very large proportion of the vehicle supply chain that comes from Asia, regardless of the propulsion for ICE and BEVs. Many years ago, we migrated our supply chains to a global basis with Asia, particularly China, getting a very big piece of that. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a number of OEMs and suppliers reshore to Mexico. We're at a situation right now that, in fact, depending on the component that you're thinking about, the demand for production in Mexico outstrips the supply. And we're seeing a number of suppliers invest very heavily, a lot in the Monterrey area, to add capacity to address this need for the demand for right shoring. Okay. And again, that is agnostic to the propulsion type, ICE versus BEV.
Mm-hmm.
The way the IRA is set right now, it in order to qualify, you need componentry that is coming from a country that has a favorable partnership with America. And so to that end, there's not really a push to drive more source to China. In fact, it's coming the other way. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Will everything come back? Absolutely not. But the key componentry absolutely will, in order to qualify under the current administration's policies.
So, based on all these things we've been talking about, are government projections, government requirements, and manufacturers' targets for transferring over or EVs taking over a large portion of the market by, say, 2030 or whatever the target date is. Are those realistic targets? Can they be met?
They're challenging to say the least. And I think we observed that, what was it, a couple months ago, when the government made adjustments to the requirements. And in fact, when you look deep into the changes, what you saw happened was that there was a step down in the penetration required by 2030, and it actually increased post that period. So I think there was an acknowledgement that we were not going to get to the original numbers at the trajectories that we're seeing today. So consequently, there was a movement, many believe spearheaded by the OEMs in partnership with the legislatures, to say, let's set targets that are more realistic. And in resetting those targets, they also changed the definition of what counts. And they move more from going with a pure electric vehicle to use what technology you can to get to these kinds of numbers. Mm-hmm. That allows for greater penetration of hybrid vehicles. So what you've seen is announcements from a number of the different OEMs that say, previously the plan was not to have anything that was an internal combustion engine. Right. Now, based on what we see happening from consumer demand and with the changes in legislation, we will start to produce, or we have reintroduced, hybrid vehicles, in many cases plug-in hybrid vehicles, into our future product portfolio out through 2030. So, implications on the supply chain. It's a little bit of a shift. And the metaphor I think about is, you've got the development process in an OEM and in a supplier. Think of it as a big ship traveling in the ocean, and you're set course with that ship in a certain direction. And then for whatever reason, you need to change direction in that ship. It takes a few minutes, takes a while, a few miles before you can turn that ship into a different direction. And I think that's additional pressure that's being put into the supply community right now for the OEMs as well as the tier suppliers, to say, all right, we're not going to be all BEV, we're going to be hybrids and BEVs and some ICE. So there is a change underway. What that really requires is an agility to manage the complexity of different powertrain applications right now. And our key message to suppliers and OEMs alike is that you need to invest in that agility.
Well, it sounds like a much more realistic expectation and much more of a chance of reaching these goals based on this more realistic portrayal. And Brian Irwin of Alvarez and Marcel, I want to thank you once again for reviewing with us the big factors that are impacting the EV industry now and in the coming years. Thank you very much for being with me. Appreciate it.